My name's Nick Taylor. I'm recording and mix engineer. I'm chief engineer here at Airedale. I've worked at most, if not all, of the studios in London at some point and at various places around the world. I work on quite a range of stuff, working with bands, pop stuff, and also I do a lot of film and TV, which makes up a lot of the work that I do. But I started in when I first moved to London. I had a job in Wessex Studios, which was now sadly no longer there, but that was a great rock and roll studio where they did The Clash. London's Calling was done there. Never Mind the Bollocks. Sex Pistols was done there, which was a really cool, just vibey, old traditional studio. Again, that sounded fantastic for drums. It was Bill Price's room. And then from there I moved on to various different studios, but I was always quite interested in film work, so I ended up at Airedale about 11 years ago now. And since then, still continued to do plenty of band and record company stuff, but also working on Mr. Turner. I think is just about to come out. I did that with Gary Yersh on the Mike Leigh film.
Oh, amazing!
It's a lovely score. I did Jack Ryan last year with Patrick Doyle. I did a really interesting film called The Double.
Okay. With
Andrew Hewitt. That's a really interesting score.
And you've done loads of amazing film scores with me.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Brilliant stuff. So Nick, tell us where we are today.
We're in Airedale Recording Studios, just off Baker Street, Marylebone in London.
Which is there's not many studios left in the West End. There used to be loads.
Exactly. I mean, I can remember walking around with my CV 15, 16 years ago, and you really could, on foot, visit 10, 12 studios without getting back on the tube, which I used to do, and trawl these CVs around everywhere. Sadly, a lot of them have gone, certainly from the centre. In Zone 1, I think there is still one on Dean Street. Apart from that, with a sizeable live room, I think we are the last, sadly. The original Olympic Studios in the 60s was just around the corner.
Okay. And Air was around the corner, wasn't it, on Oxford Street?
Yeah, exactly, before it moved up to Hampstead. It's a shame, really, but I think hopefully it's going full circle. I mean, we're certainly busier than we probably were 5 or 6 years ago.
So can you explain the history of Airedale?
Yeah, well, essentially, Airedale itself is an agency which looks after film composers, and the studio is a commercial facility that they bought in the 80s. Okay. And essentially, it has been a studio since the 50s. I think, apart from Abbey Road, I think I'm correct in saying that it's the first place in London where you could record sound after Abbey Road. And it was a theatre originally, and then it was a radio studio. They did some of Hancock's Half Hour.
Oh, really?
I think was done here.
Wow.
Though,
I never knew that.
Yeah. Radio Luxembourg was here at one point, and then it became a studio called Star Sound in the 60s.
Yeah.
And it had an even bigger live area then because it was pre-fire regulations, so you didn't need that corridor there. Okay. So that was actually part of the live area, and they did a lot of sessions here in the 60s with all the main guys of the day. Jimmy Page being one, I'm sure he was here. All those session guys. They used to do a lot of ads.
Because I've been using it for 17 years, I've seen a kind of evolution here that's been really quite interesting, because there was a period when it was owned by another company and there wasn't any money put into the studio. So it kind of fell... I mean, everything's always worked, but there was a lot of kind of like, why aren't you going to get rid of this desk and all that kind of stuff? And there's been this amazing thing because of that kind of period, which was about 10 years, where nothing was invested into the studio.
Yeah.
Suddenly, people like Nick Cave, suddenly he turned up to do the proposition and stuff, and suddenly everyone started going, the kit here is really cool, and it's kind of quite rare to have a live room of this type. It's not been converted into writing rooms or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I mean, do you want to talk about? I mean, I've never worked anywhere that's got a desk that looks like this. So I don't know if you want to tell us about the desk.
Yeah, as you say, almost by default, this is still the desk, but it's very much looked after by, there's a maintenance guy here, Paul Kirkin, who's great. He knows the desk inside out.
Yeah.
So even though it's certainly not a recent, but it's quite an old desk, everything still works.
So what is it?
It's a Kadak console,
Right.
which is a British made desk. This is actually unique. It was actually made for this room, and it's the last studio console that they ever made.
Wow.
Then they actually moved into doing more live stuff, and a lot of the theatres in the West End still are. Well, certainly a few years ago, almost all of them would have been Kadak desks. It's got fantastic mic pre's, and as I say, it's just kept in really good nick. But as you say, by default, it's become this thing that is really popular. Radiohead, I think, bought one recently.
Right.
People do get in touch about. People are becoming much more interested in them.
The other thing that I think people come here for is you've got a fantastic mic cupboard, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing that's really throughout time. I think because this was, as you say, known as a jingles company, it was mainly used for session work, so it wasn't a kind of rock and roll studio.
Yeah.
So they've got these fantastic old mics, 3 Valve U47s originals, C12, ribbon mics. They've got a fantastic mic collection. And because it primarily was used for jingles with session musicians, the stuff wasn't really as battered around as it was, and you know, a slightly more kind of professional, formal atmosphere.
Sure.
They weren't around as much smoke and drink, I suppose, as perhaps a lot of the studio mics were. So
and bugle.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, they've still pretty much, with some new additions, got the same mic collection that they had in the 60s.
Right.
Which very few studios are in that position. I mean, to buy 3 Valve U47s now that are all in good working order, would actually be quite difficult, even if you did have that kind of money.
Yeah. No.
And like you say, it came about probably by them not being able to be replaced, and now they've become these invaluable things. And still, to my mind, the best microphone ever made. You know,
it was brilliant to get you involved in Headley. We've done loads of work together. I think part of the relationship with composers or producers and engineers is one of trust. It's not only, you know, you and I share a similar aesthetic, love of tape, love of ribbons, and all of that kind of stuff. But it is just knowing that you'll get us across the finish line. We put a great team together. It was quite a complex task, though, wasn't it? I don't know if you want to talk about the actual tracking.
It was quite complex. We discussed it a lot with yourself and with Stanley and with Paul. So it didn't really worry me until we got there, because we'd been having this fairly casual conversation, and as you say, our shared aesthetic of tape, old mics. It was clear. We didn't even have to discuss how we were going to approach it almost. But the big thing was, it was questioned at one point, shall we use tape, because we very much wanted to. But it's quite an odd. Even using tape in a studio nowadays is rarely done.
Yeah,
you know,
just getting the tape is difficult.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it can slow down the process, and it inherently has problems that you don't have with digital. But the huge pro, which we found out, is that still to this day, drums particularly, I think anything particularly loud, but especially drums, just sound absolutely fantastic off tape.
But I think that we spoke about the actual tape player that you did actually get, which was the last Studer, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think
it was the last model.
I believe so. Yeah, Studer A827. The one that you usually see is the A800, and the 827 is slightly more recent than that. And by that point, tape machines, people think of them as inherently noisy, but they're actually amazingly engineered pieces of kit.
Yeah, because there's decades of evolution going into perfecting that technology.
Exactly, yeah.
And the sonic quality of and the musicality of it. You know, digital is in its infancy compared to where tape got to.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, a good way to put it. I mean, that's the thing. They're actually very quiet pieces of kit.
Yeah.
This inherent noise problem that people flag up, obviously compared to digital silence, there is a noise, but when you've got someone particularly like Chad Smith banging the kit, it's really not a problem. I mean, it's not a problem on most things, you know, or anything arguably.
No.
I mean, when you listen, obviously you only have to listen to records made before 20 years ago, and they're almost undoubtedly were done to tape, and no one used to complain about that. And I think definitely something has been lost.
Well, I couldn't believe the difference. It's just chalk and cheese, isn't it?
Yeah, no,
I mean, it's
I
kind
was
of
surprised.
so much so that it made me nervous, because you kind of go, I think we have been sold up the Swanee a little bit. It's not. It's nothing to do with hiss and warmth and sound. It's perspective. It's how it makes you feel. It's the impact that it has on you. It's so incredible.
Definitely, it's that. It was actually quite reassuring. Like, thank God, it was actually worth it, and it very much was worth it. And when we got Chad on the bus and Roger as well, they were surprised. So it wasn't just us going into this minutiae of, is there a difference? Isn't there? There is a difference, and it's really quite obvious when you A/B them. Having said that, it's the work, to backtrack slightly, it complicated matters because we needed a backup. So not only were we running to tape, we were running a clean digi signal as well.
Yeah.
And then obviously we were recording a digital signal post tape, and we had a day to set up, full day at Headley Grange, which was fantastic. But when we got there, it kind of hit me like, this is a lot to set up.
Yeah, it's a big signal path, isn't it?
Exactly, and it's quite a big, complex signal path. And there was a moment when we got there, I was slightly overwhelmed, and that 5 minutes went, and we just got on with it. And I didn't quite... Actually, John, the owner of the house, he's at the end of the second day, after we'd recorded Chad, he just said, I've just realised you've been really tense all day. I thought that's your personality. But once we realised it had gone well, as soon as I heard Chad start playing, it was like we couldn't have done arguably, we couldn't have done I'm so glad we approached it in the way that we did.
And for me, as the day went on, it was clear that actually, we're quite modest types, us lot, the Spitfire lot, and yourself. But it was a historical day, and we had we had a service to history to not set up a laptop and and a Farface 800 and off you go. We had to do it properly.
Yeah, no, I think actually even when you've got people like Roger Taylor and Chad Smith, who have played the best and biggest venues in the world for decades.
Yeah.
They were excited. I mean, just so, and that made us more excited. But then to go in there when they came in and they saw the kind of TLC, we'd taken over the whole thing, not compromising anything.
Yeah.
The mic pre's, the mics, basically setting up exactly as I would do if we were at Abbey Road almost.
Yeah.
A facility which is made, because obviously although Headley Grange is famous for drum recordings and for recordings generally, it's very much not a studio. It's someone's home. There's no tie lines, there's nothing. So to get there with the tape, like I say, doing a session on tape now is a hassle in a studio, in most studios.
Yeah.
Doing it in someone's house with a data setup, it's quite a big deal. And it didn't, as I say, it didn't hit me until kind of we'd done it.
Yeah.
And I just felt this huge weight
I bet.
drop, and it was just like so reassuring, and just to hear the huge difference it did make.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're not letting the foot off the gas pedal with the mix either. We've made quite a lot of demands on you, because obviously we want to approach it like you would a record, a normal mix, but there's also a lot of outputting, so that we have a lot of different options and stuff. The problem that I have with a lot of drum libraries is they sound like fully mastered. They have a characteristic that you can't unmaster, uncompress, undistort. Yeah. So the brief I gave you was mix it like you've just recorded the drums and you've got your great drum sound up before you start tracking the rest of the instruments, and you're in your heart of hearts you're a bit disappointed that you're going to have to put guitars and vocals on, because it sounds great. So do you want to talk about your approach?
No, very much. Yeah, essentially the approach, as you say, was very organic, and it was to approach it like I'm mixing a record for a band. And you get that sound where you have a fantastic monitor mix where it's just really, really vibey. Technically, there may be things you can improve, little noises or whatever, that we're not concerned about, because it's going to be overlaid with other stuff. It's not about getting this pristine. It's just getting the vibiest possible sound, everything coming through the desk. Absolutely nothing whatsoever being done in the box. I haven't used a single plug-in.
That's great news.
Which by itself is fairly rare nowadays. But then, we're in a studio. We have a nice desk. We've got nice outboard. We're approaching this. Your brief, as you say, was very much to do it as organic and vibey as possible, which is how most engineers love to work. Nowadays, you have to compromise that because of deadlines and getting from A to B as quickly as possible. Not just getting it sounding good, but getting it sounding good in a short amount of time.
You're giving us 3 different mixes, and then we're doing things in floors, and you want to just go through the different signals that you're kind of printing.
Yeah, essentially, which I think worked out really well. Obviously, Headley Grange, it has there's 3 stories to it. Yeah. So, and listening back to some of the recordings that have been done there was helpful prior to going there. But then what was most helpful was going there to do a recce beforehand. Yeah. And it's just one of those spaces you can't help but walk in and think how you're going to mic it up, knowing what we're doing. And it was pretty obvious, I think, from the start where you would put the kit, where you wanted the ambient mics, and it worked out really well. So essentially we had the close mics, which is fairly conventional how I would normally mic a kit in a studio, using as much valve and ribbon mics as possible, really. So the 3 distinct mixes essentially are close, mid, and the Grange, which is essentially, they speak for themselves, but essentially the close mics mic'd fairly conventionally. And then we've got the mid, where you're inputting signal from the first floor. Okay. Which was my favourite personally. I think that perspective sounds fantastic. And then there's the Grange, where you're utilising all the mics in the space.
It's a very big sound, and it's one of those things that you listen in isolation, you go, I don't know if that's useful, but actually if you listen to, I don't know, I always go back to old Motown records that tend to start with a drum beat for a few bars, and you just listen, and it's just 100% room. But the minute the band comes in, they sit behind, and that's, I think, something that's missing from modern recordings. Everything's like your ears right next to every single thing. And so I think it'd be interesting. I'm looking forward to using it and seeing if I can fit it into stuff,
Well, like most sample libraries, I don't use them nearly as much as yourself, but most sample libraries, to me, don't seem to be doing that, utilising that vibe. Basically, not thinking about sampling, just thinking about how you would do it if you were working with a band. Which is arguably, I think, the only proper way to do it, really.
What juicy outboard are you using for?
Well, there's obviously the EQ is all done on the desk, so the EQ you hear is all done with the Kadak EQ, and then there's the Neve 33609s, which I've got on the ground floor U47s. So these were mics placed in front of the kit, picking up the room on the ground floor only, just tickling them really with the 33609. And then we've got the first floor M160s, which is 2 Bayer ribbon mics placed on the landing. They're going through a Manley Vari-Mu compressor. And then the second floor, so up on the highest, we've got the Roya F24 mic stereo ribbon in Bloomline. That's going through, going through another Manley Vari-Mu. And then there's a C12 here, which was in Omni. Again, another perspective from the top level. That sounds really nice. That's going through a Uri 1176. Classic.
I think what I like about this selection is, it emphasises that this is not us doing a vintage recording. It's a very modern sound.
Yeah, I mean,
and by using the Manleys, you're using the best of the old and the new, and I think that's an important point to get across.
No, great, and that's just reminding me that the mix then is across the mix. I've got the Vacrac, which Inward Connections, which is a US-based company, and they do these brilliant compressors based on the vintage compressors we all love, but they're made today, and they sound great. So it's not about doing things vintage for the sake of it. It's just using the best gear, and often that is old stuff.
It's heritage, but also what what hip hop has done to where the kick drum sits in mixes, and indeed what Chad and the Chili Peppers have done. Have taken those P-Funk kind of Sly and the Family Stone and the recordings have developed. And I think that's an important kind of point.